Hello everyone, today I'm with James Meetze, and James is the author of 5 books on poetry, including Phantom Hour in 2016 and Dayglo in 2011, which was the winner of the Sawtooth Poetry Prize. He teaches writing and film studies at the University of Arizona Global Campus and in the Depth Psychology and Creativity program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. James divides his time between Split in Croatia and San Diego. So welcome, James.
Thank you, John, for having me.
I was hoping to start with he splits his time between Split and San Diego, but then I thought, I think I've got a feeling about 10,000 people might have already
It is not an unfamiliar pun, but nonetheless, it's the resonance of it is not lost on me.
James, today we're talking about Orpheus, and I was reading in your dissertation on Orphic capability and the lyric self that Orpheus is somewhere in between Apollo and Dionysus, and I like that because as a lover of Hillman or whatever, there's often that Apollo, the cool distant reason, the analysis from a far off distance or whatever, and then there's Dionysus, who's a little bit closer to the earth, the body, nature, instinctual life, or whatever. But then I was thinking, when I was reading that, I was thinking, yeah, and then there's like Orpheus is sometimes forgotten in one way, that in the common parlance, Jung parlance or whatever. Not forgotten by writers and artists, by the way, but there's this tremendous figure of Orpheus who's been an inspiration for writers and poets for a long time.
Right, indeed. Beside being the god of cold reason, Apollo is also the god of poetry and of prophecy. Yeah. Whereas Dionysus is associated with those qualities, characteristics that we, I think, more commonly associate with those who are prophetic, right? That openness to ecstasy. And I think Orpheus is right at the nexus of that tension between them, because Orpheus is the hero of poetry. Orpheus receives the lyre from Apollo. In many stories, Apollo is said to be his father, because I like to believe that Orpheus was a real person who existed. I tend more toward the thinking of the father being the Thracian king Agris, but even still, his mother is Calliope, the muse. So I don't know. I don't know how we really arrive at the real person, but Dionysus also being the deific representation of that idea of boundary crossing, right, between reality and ecstasy, losing oneself to something other, something beyond. And I think that's exactly what Orpheus, for me at least, and what I try to argue in my dissertation and when I'm teaching about Orpheus, or when he appears in my poetry, this is sort of what I'm trying to argue that he represents symbolically. This connection to poetry, this connection to structure, I think, but also this ability to open oneself to something that is outside, something that is ecstatic, and something that can only be received.
Sometimes get the feeling with Dionysus, there's a little bit of wild abandon, a little bit of dark side in there as well, or whatever. But with Orpheus, it seems to kind of like, I don't know, these were just my thoughts, but it seems like there's there's that accent too on song, myth, poetry, music. I remember your colleague Mary Antonia Wood saying that in the archetypal artist that the ancestors of the creative person is that poet, seer, shaman.
Right.
And you get a bit of that feeling from Orpheus.
You do. We can get into that in greater detail, but maybe that's yet to come. But I think this idea that you mention of Dionysus and darkness. Orpheus also has this darkness, right? Not only does he descend to the underworld out of grief, right? Is it really out of love, or is it out of grief? Or is it out of desire beyond love, self-love, ego? There's a darkness inherent in whatever it is that drives him in that one of many stories attributed to him. It's full of darkness. When he comes out, there is darkness. He is disembodied by the worshippers of Dionysus. So we have this both literal and figural tension of Orpheus being granted his gift by Apollo. Hermes created the lyre, and Orpheus perfected it. But Orpheus gets it not from Hermes, but by way of Apollo. And then it is the followers of Dionysus who in turn tear him apart, who try to silence his gift, which, for whatever reason, continues on even after his dismemberment. But it's hard to deny. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to deny that there's darkness inherent in that. And this is also this, sure, it's perhaps a bit cliche to think of the poet as having a darkness, the artist as having a bit of darkness. But I think that tension between light and dark, between joy and depression, between states of being is necessary. That tension is necessary to the creation of interesting art.
Well, James, hopefully, if we can come back to this soon, but I just wanted to ask, by way of start, how did you get into all this stuff? How did that happen? And I remember reading something about your college undergraduate days and reading Allen Ginsberg and
it's a real story made for a movie, I think, in some ways. And it was before college. My high school English teacher, literature teacher, Jerry Shimke, R.I.P., literally threw the book at me. And that impact changed the course of my life. It opened for me all of this interest in poetry, which of course begets this interest in things that are bigger, more intellectual, more esoteric, especially beginning as I did with Ginsberg. And as I just told my students at Pacifica, because I'm teaching a course on creative influence across the humanities at the present moment, Ginsberg is a great example. I was very lucky to have this example as far as influence is concerned, because he named all of his influences And so there was already this sort of guidebook laid out for me to follow. And Ginsberg's influences were quite broad. And so that led me, of course, to Whitman, to William Carlos Williams, to Garcia Lorca, but also to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, to St. John of the Cross, to a lot of these, spiritual, esoteric writers throughout history, not just North American writers, but writers everywhere, and not just writers also. And so that gave me this, I think, the seeds or the acorns, or the acorn that led me to become the particular, in Hillmanian parlance, to become the particular oak that I had to become. Even though, as you've read, I spend a lot of time talking about influence, about Orphic capability, about being a poet as more like the rhizome as opposed to the tree. And that then is an idea that comes from Jung. So, in all of these ways, I sort of found myself led by the voices of others, which is what I'm really interested in talking about, and interested in listening to.
James, I've got a couple of questions for you. Did you ever write any poetry when you were a kid, like 8, 9, 10, or whatever? Did you ever, or was it something that emerged when you were an undergraduate?
It was something that emerged really upon being struck by that book.
Yeah.
When I opened it and read, it was the first language, the first text that spoke to me in a way that I felt kinship to. It was the first thing that made sense to me on a deeper level. It called to me. So I immediately read and began imitating.
And was Ginsberg influenced? Well, one thing I found interesting, as a young kid growing up, lover of the 60s or whatever, there was Allen Ginsberg and, Jack Kerouac on the road and all of that. But I hadn't heard of the San Francisco Renaissance movement that you talk about with Jack Spicer and Robin Blaser and others. And I find it fascinating that there were these people in the US very inspired by Orpheus, it seems, in many ways. But was Allen Ginsberg in contemporaries of those people and knew all of those people, or was he a little separate from
that? No, they were contemporaries. They would have been likely at the 6 Gallery reading when Ginsberg first read Howl. They were in the same larger poetry circles in the Bay Area. Some of their personalities, of course, clashed. My dear departed friend, Kevin Killian, wonderful poet, playwright, novelist, and biographer, wrote the biography of Jack Spicer called Poet Be Like God. And in that book, he talks a little bit about the tensions between Spicer and his circle and Ginsberg and his circle. Though, Ginsberg was already famous at that point and was between San Francisco and New York and on the Rolling Thunder Review with Dylan and, all over the place.
Two people that stick out from me from just totally iconic from that, Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg are just kind of two very, very unusual people from that whole period of time.
Right, unusual people, unusual figures in the larger context of their era, because they were both early adopters, I think. And became figureheads for a huge cultural transformation. that occurred. Of course, largely because of ecstatic practices or ecstatic curiosities. But I think that's wonderful. And I think that that's something that a lot of artists share, that quest for some ecstatic experience beyond the pedestrian, in search of inspiration, in search of material, in search of being able to hear, be granted access to those other voices that speak beyond and through the poet or maker.
Yeah, that's nice. I like this one. Sorry, this is an excursion maybe, but you wrote this. In time, every man unbuilds the armature that supports him. And, I was thinking it's kind of like life as a kind of I'm not meant to interpret it too much, but just for me, life kind of softens you up to an opening, to a being more open, to a wider heart, to be able to have some of those experiences maybe that you were just talking about.
Absolutely. And surprisingly, I remember writing that. Usually I would say, is that me? It probably wasn't. But no, to me, that speaks to the idea of both personal and artistic evolution, transformation, if you will. We have to unbuild the structures to which we cling in order to move into a new structure, in order to add on, to add this to the house, right? So in that sense, if we are conscious of it, if we are actually doing the work, we are dismantling those structures that bind us to our moment, so that we can enable movement toward the next moment, a greater moment, maybe not greater, but whatever
Wider,
expands.
bigger.
Right, wider. Opening, always opening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So, but it seems to me that whilst there was iconic Allen Ginsberg, what I found fascinating was Jack Spicer and the others. They were talking about, what is it, the long song, the serial poem. What's this all about? Carmen, perpetuum, that kind of long and continuous song. It's like, it was really a wonderful conversation going, wasn't it? And it's about a different form of the poem, or what's it about?
Right. The Carmen Perpetuum is an idea that comes from, or at least that Robin Blaser named, although it was Jack Spicer who came up with this term, the serial poem. It's found in one of his Vancouver lectures that are collected in the book, The House That Jack Built. He gave a series of lectures right at the end of his life. He died at 40 of cirrhosis and alcoholism, burned out. And he came up with this idea of the serial poem, and he talks about it more eloquently than I ever will, but says that in essence, one must always be working forward, never backward, which also I find so pertinent to thinking of Orpheus, because I disagree with Spicer. I think one must be a bit more Janus-faced looking forward and backward at the same time, to know where one is, so to know where one is headed, or to know the possibilities to which one might head. And also Robert Duncan, who was probably the most widely known of this triumvirate, these three poets. He was longtime partners with the painter and artist Jess Collins. He taught at the Black Mountain Institute, was engaged with the poet Charles Olson in thinking about projective verse, in moving this poetry into this wider perspective that you were mentioning. But so all three of these poets are working in this serial form, writing not with the singular poem as the unit, but with the entire book as the unit. And when I first, as a young poet, came to that idea, it really spoke to me, because the single poem is a lovely thing, but what happens when it's bigger? What happens when it's in conversation with the single poems that surround it? What echoes might occur, right? How does the poem or the book become a chorus, which is also akin to what I think of this idea of Orphic capability being this, Greek chorus, speaking what we know but can't quite grasp through the singular poet. Always this multiple, always the I is always plural.
So is that the form that you've adopted in your books?
It is, for the most part. Though I will admit that at this point, I guess I would say I'm a mid-career poet at this point. That's the term that we use. I am finding it, I've just come out of a 12-year-long process of writing one single poem called The Long Now. And it's kind of lovely to just write a little poem here, a little poem there. Right. One-off singles, but it's also, we've moved from the era of the album into the era of the single, the digitally available single, if we're talking about music. So it fits perhaps the attention span of our contemporary moment, which the long serial poem sadly does not. So it becomes more difficult to get the work out there, right? And it is maybe a little old-fashioned. It's a little bit of a throwback to the 60s, 70s.
Well, I think ever since Facebook, what I've noticed is if you post on Facebook, this is a little backyard, marketing analysis going. If you post on Facebook, if it's short and sweet, up to maybe 4 lines, then it engages. But if it's longer, you only get the people that are really maybe interested in the topic, really into. So it's kind of like we've been, what's the word? We're just, Camille Paglia said, glittering images. We're just so overwhelmed with images or something. It's almost like they have to be short and sharp.
Well, I don't want to name names, but I think there are a host of, I guess, what we'd call Instagram poets that have become some of the biggest poetry sellers of all time. Not because their poems are necessarily good. I don't think most of them are. I can go on record saying that. I think they are actively.
Hang on, I'm just writing that down.
I think they are actively bad. And yet, I think they resonate with people. But I think that is a symptom of our moment. It is a symptom of our being addicted to instant gratification,
our attention span,
and our attention span, right, which grows ever shorter and shorter. And I don't think people necessarily want to work for meaning, you know, want to spend time with a poem to actually be moved by it. It's easier to say, oh, that resonates with me, and then move on. You can repost it, and there it exists. It has been seen. It has been repeated. But does it engender any deeper thought? Does it engender any personal transformation? Does it speak to the soul on a deeper level? Or is it just this, have we lost our connection to soul, and it only speaks to this superficial tether to...
Well, it might be an entree. Like, you know, I don't know. Sometimes people have said something very beautiful in one or two lines, haven't they? And it might be a lead in,
of course,
somewhere down the track. You know, Rumi has said many quotable things in one or two lines or whatever. And sometimes I think with poetry, if one hasn't been exposed to a lot of poetry when you were young, that you just have to read one or two good poems and it'll hook you in there, you know, and then maybe, but
right.
But the wider point I take from what you're saying is, I think Hillman said somewhere, this is a time without reflection or connection. It's kind of like, that's the psychopathic nature of our action. So this thing of slowing down and reflecting, and when you were talking about the soul, I kind of find that essential these days. You gotta go down into things more and give yourself time to do that. You know, go into the feeling and the reflection and
right, you do. And to be clear, I entirely agree with you. Many wonderful things have been said with great brevity. I mean, I think of Basho, Li Po, early haiku, Rumi, of course, Hafez, Kabir, who I always, the 15th century mystic poet that I always bring into this class. Between the conscious and the unconscious, the mind sets up a swing, he writes, in the 15th century.
he'd been reading Jung. He'd been reading Jung, for sure.
Or Robert Bly, who translated it, had. But yeah, I think very, very powerful things have been said with great brevity. And I think it's absolutely possible to continue saying them. But whether people really want to ingest those things or digest them, I think that's the longer process, to digest those things, those ideas, those images, and really see how they work within the body, right? How they live inside you once you spend time with them, and what they do therein. That's something that a lot of people, and I can't speak in generalities, but I think a lot of people don't really have time for.
And you know what I was taking also, James, is I think when you go to uni, you know, and you get, inducted into formal writing, there's got to be a beginning, a middle, and end. And at the beginning, you say what you're going to say, and and all of that. And I've found what I liked when I was reading, when you were talking about the long song and carmen, perpetuum, but I found, wow, I wonder whether you can write a book like that, like a nonfiction, like to be open, like when Jung built his house in Bollinger or whatever, and it's like he didn't have that kind of preset plan, and he just found a rock, down there near the lake or something, and then that became this and that became, so it was an organic thing. And I thought, well, that takes a lot of pressure off as a writer, if you think like that. Or there's something more beautiful about it.
Potentially, but it also takes a great deal of patience, a great deal of practice, a great deal of knowing what you're doing before you get to that point, in order to manage it when it when it organically comes, because those things can very easily get out of control and go beyond our grasp.
Well, I wondered, this is just a personal question for you, as a kind of a scholar and a poet, how do you live with like this thing of the directed thinking, everything that you have to do, the course at Pacifica, and keeping in that open poetic space? How do you resolve that kind of thinking within yourself?
It's a real challenge, to be honest. I often tell my wife, I've just graded an entire novel with comments on every page. Do I want to now go read one? No. But it takes time and energy to get into that headspace, to get into that space of openness and access, right? Robin Blaser says in his essay, The Fire, about Orpheus, this sort of sentimentalized vision that we have is that he has a figure that has power over trees, stones, animals, right, through his song. But what's really more important, what's more interesting, is that he has entrance and access to, right? He is able to cross the threshold. It's not the power over these things.
In Orpheus in charge of animals idea.
Yeah, right. Which is something that we get in the image of Christ when we get the Good Shepherd, tending his flock. This is less important in the figure of Orpheus as a symbol for creativity, even though it's beautiful and wonderful. And I think it's necessary to have this interaction with nature. I think that's the metaphor at work there. And Blaser says something to the effect of, the outsideness is a kind of metaphor for the sense of the process that leads to the poem. I'm trying to remember this, that it's like a translation, a word which holds the meaning of the word metaphor, which means bringing over, right? So it's the word metaphor, which I think is so important to the reading of Jung. Hillman talks about it a lot, is that a lot of it is metaphor. A lot of it is based in metaphor, something being taken as something else, but being brought over from, the image being brought into the talk of it. And that is the idea that I have of Orphic capability. It is this being able to cross over and bring something back into the work, into the language, into the art. So it's a bit of translation, it's a bit of dictation, it's a bit of theft.
Theft? We can't have that on this podcast.
Borrowing. Right. I think I went a little awry of the question, but
no, I was thinking though while you were talking is, you know how Hillman loves the animals and the animal dreams and all that. Like I might see it a bit more these days as the animals around Orpheus, the animals of the imagination, you know. So it's kind of like a two-way thing. There's the being open to the other and what's, you know, coming from beyond in my language, and then there's this kind of like the animals of our own dreams, the animals of our imagination. You know, maybe that. I mean, does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And then what if one were able to manifest those animals of their dreams, right? What if one were able to call them? I don't necessarily want to say call them to heal, because that puts them in service of us, but
Yeah.
you know, call them to our aid, call them to our side as companions. I think that's one of the beautiful metaphors that we can attach to Orpheus, that Hillman also gets into. Animal Presences is that right? Is that book from the Uniform Edition?
It's just interesting that right back from the beginning of his time in Zurich, he collected these animal dreams, you know, and it's always seemed to me to be a large part of what he did. And but it, you know, I think that like I think of all those animals around, you know, and the display and all of that. But then I'm wondering, you know, with what you do at Pacifica and also University of Arizona, you know, writing and teaching writing and film studies and creativity at Pacifica. What are you doing there? What are you trying to convey to, and what kind of things do you take up? And you know, keeping Orpheus there in the frame.
Well, I do keep my two jobs a bit compartmentalized from one another in a certain respect, because they are very different. You know, at Pacifica, I have much greater flexibility to, it's a program in the humanities, right? So I get to bring in everything. We're not just focused on the act of writing or the analysis of film. We do both of those things, but also. And my students there are also bringing such a breadth of experience and talent to the program that I'm always learning as much from them as they learn from me. And I hope they know that. I try to openly admit it. What am I trying to do? You know, for the majority of my students, I'm just trying to open access to a deeper understanding of the world and to greater communication skills that they can apply regardless of where they end up, what they end up doing. Because I know there's very little chance that one studies writing and becomes a writer or becomes a teacher or becomes an editor. You know, these professions as they have existed are more nebulous and less accessible. They exist less readily than they did before. So whatever it is, you know, I love to foster critical thinking, just the ability to see an issue from multiple perspectives, whether that be buying a dishwasher or you know, making a choice of how you align yourself politically, or how you engage with other humans in, you know, in conflict, and really just hopefully to bring a greater sense of joy and beauty to the experience of being alive. Pacifica is kind of a special situation in that it's a bit self-selecting, right? A certain type of person with a certain type of interest, with a certain type of intention, gravitates toward this place, which is magical. It's an absolutely wonderful place, and I think such beautiful things are made there and come out of there, and such wonderful, brilliant people are there. But it's a microcosm, right? Like anyone who's a Jungian or a post-Jungian, a Hillmanian, it's a microcosm, right? This is not the majority of people in the field of psychology. Mythology is most likely thought of as children's stories, I think. For a lot of people, we don't see how archetypal figures are actually so integral to everything that we encounter. All art and media and personality, these things are very present. And so, we have those people who are open to seeing that, who are interested and curious about studying that further, and then people for whom passing knowledge or an awareness of these things that do exist might open them up to wider thinking.
I agree with you. It's a fantastic, like I was thinking there's nothing like that in Australia. I remember doing psychology at uni when it was rats and stats and all of that. But I see the influence coming out of Pacifica Graduate. I kind of see it seeping out. Like, just lately, I might have spoken to 3 or 4 or 5 people that all from Pacifica, and the way it's interdisciplinary. So it's not, just Jung kind of thing, like Jungianism or whatever. To me, that's a wonderful thing. But then, as you say, the myth and the mythopoesis and
right. And as I remind my students all the time, I'm a poet. I'm going to, that's my expertise. That is my primary creative outlet. So I'm going to talk about poetry a lot. However, the word poesis, from the Greek word poesis, from which we come to poetry, literally just means to make. So whatever it is one makes, be it poetry or sculpture or home building or film, whatever it is one makes, be that performance, food, I don't know. It all has a poetics, a theory of making.
I think there's that line from Jung, or maybe someone else said it, but it was like, if I don't happen to be a poet, then perhaps I make myself or whatever. But I always think for anyone that's like what I come across is there's millions of people writing in one way or another, journal writing or, writing books or just interested in writing big time. And if you don't happen to be a poet, but what I would say is the poetic basis of mind is something that you can open, like I would see that as what you're talking about with Orphic capability, is that I can open to the poetic basis of the mind. Because sometimes if you read psychology, like old school psychology, which can be disgusting when it's so conceptual and dry, or sometimes I find that anyway. But for someone, for example, to have some expertise in psychology and then have that more poetic basis of the mind, I find that that's when writing can really start to talk to you. Even if they're...
I agree.
Yeah. I
agree. And that's something that Hillman talks about a lot, is this poetic basis of mind. Just talking about the imaginal, talking about the importance of imagination I think the poetic basis of mind is inherent in that.
And somehow, I don't know, for you, like, there's some secret in it too about, there's some jump, isn't there? Like, I remember that, I can't tell you the exact story, but Rumi had his, in Australian language, he had his mate Shams from Tabrizi or wherever he was from. And they were down somewhere and Shams got all these books and threw them in the pond or something like that. That's the guts of the story. And Rumi got a little bit, what's the word, thrown out of his comfort zone. But the whole thing was to make, he'd been this scholar or whatever, and then Rumi became the poet, or as the story goes, or whatever. But there's a jump, isn't there? There's a jump from, a jump into the poetic.
Right, and it's there is, and it's a leap of faith to a certain extent, right? It's a leap into the unknowing, into the primordial sea. It takes a great deal of courage to, one, do something that nobody really cares about. And it's, oh, you're a poet, what do you really do? Oh, you write poetry, that's so quaint. But no, it really is this a craft that one studies and grows over time, over a lifetime of doing, of making. And it does require a leap. It requires a leap to, one, go there, to write the poem. Then it requires another leap to admit that one is a poet.
But then there's also something about how you're engaging with the world, the richness of a fuller engagement or whatever, isn't it? Like conceptual, again, it's hard for me not to use jargon. That's what I'm a specialist in, jargon. But the thing is, it's so easy to be conceptual. I was thinking the other day, like, to open yourself to the divine is the beauty and the terror. You can see why we do it. We'd rather kind of, hide behind the conceptual. So it's kind of like, to me, there's just not the poetry that, you're creating or whatever, but it's this thing of how to actually open to the world, whatever you want to call it, the anima mundi or whatever, but the full scope of it.
Right, and it enables a way of seeing that I think is not everyone is privy to, right? It is a bit occult in its nature, because you have to leap in order to grant access. You have to want access. You have to be curious about what is, what's on the other side, right? And then that's the beauty for me of Orpheus, is that he does go to the others. There are a handful of Greek heroes that cross into the underworld and come back. But Orpheus comes back with the intention of bringing something. And at the last moment, if you like the story, I'd say he chooses art, right? He goes in for love, and at that last moment chooses his art, the memory, the image, right? The perfect image of love rather than the reality of it. And it is choosing art. And that's a hard choice to make. Or is it?
Or a brave choice.
Right.
But the longing that some people have, I think, I was reading what Hillman wrote about Orpheus, and talks about that longing. So some people have that longing, don't they? It's a big thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, the whole of Romantic poetry came out of this sense of longing to a certain extent. But I think a lot of it comes from a longing, and not just a romantic longing, but it's curiosity, right? I think we can equate to a certain extent longing with the compulsion of being curious, perpetual curiosity, longing for knowledge, for understanding, for experience. And what better way to get that than to write toward it? I've always told my poetry students when they ask, or anybody who asks, why do you write? I'm writing toward an answer I know that I can never attain. And yet I am compelled to keep trudging away.
That's the long song. That's the long song.
That's it. That's it. That's exactly it.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. And I mean, what what else do you find when you're teaching this at Pacifica? What else do you find? Do you find that people go through that open?
I find that they do. I find that a lot already have, or are at least very open to it, testing the waters of the river Lethe, if you will. Maybe they want to cross. But one thing I find is just that students, not all of them, of course, but many of them, many more than I would suspect, really resonate with this figure of Orpheus in this context in which I bring him to the fore, bring his presence into the room. And I think it's because this idea of boundary crossing, the idea of being a one who loves, the idea of being one who sings even after death. I think there's this sort of eternal song. Again, it's this long song, right? That Orpheus gives us permission to believe in, this life after death, or that our what we produce, what we make will live on after we die, right? The songs we sing have the potential to live on. And I think people are just really drawn to that. But also there's such, there are so many versions of Orpheus. There are so many representations in art and music and film and poetry, and in religions all across the world, in myth all across the world. There
because
are these...
healing is one that we haven't spoken about. Orpheus, right. The healer.
Right. These are... there's a multiplicity of approaches, of entrances to this singular figure, a singular figure who is necessarily multiple.
Yeah.
And so that gives people, I think, just greater ease of access from wherever they may be coming. They can latch on to something and find for themselves, I think, a bit of that multiplicity, that I am greater than just what I think. I am greater than just what I call myself. I am more than just how others see me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's lovely. I was thinking when you were talking then, Orpheus might be the god of the cultural creatives or something like that. But not that, but this is another thing I find interesting. I don't know what you think about this, James. So sometimes, I don't know, what Jung said something like, what is your myth? Like, to ask that question, what is my myth or whatever. But sometimes it's a bit of a combination of different figures. I think they're all kind of interrelated. Not only is Orpheus multiple, but I can relate to a bit of a Hermes, relate to Orpheus. So it's like it's not a kind of a clear-cut thing, is it?
It's not, and as we said at the beginning, you can't really talk about Orpheus without also invoking Apollo, without also invoking Dionysus, without also invoking the Muses and Hermes. So you have this constellation around this singular figure that always comes along with him. A motley crew.
The god
of gods, yeah, of gods and heroes.
And I mean, one last question maybe is, in popular culture, in the movies, where are you seeing Orpheus?
Almost everywhere. We spoke the other day about Celine Sciamma's film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, recent French film that is metatextually Orphic. It does the Orpheus myth with two women falling in love, while also acknowledging that it is doing the Orpheus myth. They read it in the middle of the film. I just showed Orfeo Negro, Black Orpheus, Marcel Camus' film from 1956 that takes place in Rio de Janeiro during Carnival. But also, I think in a much more pop culture sense that, these are art films where this sort of thing takes place. And they're both also referencing the first art film to do Orpheus, Jean Cocteau's Orphée from 1950. But I think we see it even in superhero movies who have to descend, but it's just that Campbellian hero's journey cycle of descending into the depths of reincarnation, of coming out with something that saves the day, of bringing something across. And for however cheap it might appear, though it be very expensive to make, it is, in its essence, Orphic. The gods, bidden or bidden, not bidden, the gods will be present, right?
Yeah.
They show up, and I think the Orphic shows up, but that's only my perception of it. Someone else, might see a different myth at the core.
Well, you could just see the hero myth. That's what I was thinking when you were talking. But
right, of course,
as you're talking, you can see, in the hero myth, bringing back the treasure is a little bit like the creative person bringing some form back, isn't it? Or bringing something back, whether it be, a piece of writing or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. Well, maybe that's a good place to finish there. And thank you very much.
Seems like it. Thank you so much, John, for having me.